Eddard Stark stood alone in the dimly lit solar, the weight of an entire kingdom pressing upon his shoulders. Dawn's first glow was still some hours away, and the distant roar of the sea beyond the Red Keep's walls seemed to whisper secrets that promised no comfort. The windows were closed, the room stifling, but the chill in his heart was far more oppressive. In his hand, he held the words that changed everything. Proof that Robert Baratheon's children were not his own. He had discovered the secret that Cersei Lannister guarded so viciously. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were children born of her incestuous liaison with her twin brother, Jaime. Ned had pored over the lineage, read and reread the entries in the book of the lineages and histories of the great houses. There was no doubt. The truth stared him in the face, unyielding, condemning. He had intended to make sure Stannis Baratheon, Robert's eldest surviving brother, would inherit the Iron Throne. That was the lawful course. But in the small hours of that fateful night, a new thought came to him, one that he tried to push away but which refused to be silenced. Joffrey was a boy of uncertain temper and vicious whims, yet Myrcella and Tommen were still children, sweet-natured in their own ways. They would not survive if Stannis or Renly or the Lannisters laid claim in the midst of a civil war. At best, the children might be imprisoned. At worst, they might be executed to prevent them from becoming rallying points for Lannister loyalists. Ned's soul roiled at the injustice of it. They were innocents. He had tried so hard to do what was right, to keep the realm from bleeding. But the realm was already at the brink. The memory of Robert's fierce grin, his booming laughter, and the strong friendship they'd once shared long ago at the Eyrie drifted into Ned's mind. He could almost hear Robert's voice. "Protect my children, Ned." Truth be told, Robert's actual words at his death had been hurried, disjointed, but the sentiment was there. Protect his children. Robert, not knowing that Joffrey was not his own, had asked for them to be safeguarded. Ned had tried to convey the truth to Robert in his final hours but had faltered, uncertain how to deliver such devastating news to a dying man. Now it was too late, and the kingdom was in a precarious balance. If word leaked that the heirs were illegitimate, if Stannis rallied the Stormlands, if Tywin Lannister marched from the west, everything Robert had held together through might and presence alone would shatter into a war more devastating than even the rebellion that had toppled the Targaryens. Ned felt that cold fist in his chest tighten further when he recalled how Cersei had tried to bargain with him. She had come to him in the Godswood, speaking in riddles, appealing to his sense of honor, or rather trying to manipulate it. But the threat behind her green eyes had been real. She would do anything to protect her children, and that meant if he proclaimed the truth, the bloodshed would begin at once. She would not hesitate to kill Ned or to see all of House Stark destroyed in her attempt to guard her brood. He had been determined to do the lawful thing and proclaim Stannis the rightful heir. But the images of the children drifted in his mind, reminding him of the innocence that would be devoured by the realm's cruelty. He remembered Sansa's sweet longing to marry Joffrey. How naive that wish now seemed, but she had grown fond of Myrcella, and Arya had even smiled at Tommen once, calling him a decent boy among a nest of vipers. There might be no mercy for any of them if a war erupted. And then, in the thick hush of that solar, a thought slithered in. If he, Eddard Stark, proclaimed himself protector of the realm, no, more than that, if he claimed the throne himself, he might be able to shield the children from the wrath of Stannis or the vengeance of the Lannisters. The very notion was unthinkable, a betrayal of every principle he held dear. He was not the rightful heir. He was not born of royal blood. He was the Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and a man who abhorred ambition. Yet, the alternative was to watch these children who had known him as their father's friend or as the unassuming hand of the king be torn apart. The moment the truth broke, all would be overshadowed by the scramble for the crown. He whispered a silent prayer to the old gods. Was it a greater sin to topple the rightful line, or to allow the certain slaughter of innocents? Robert was gone, and all that remained were children who would inherit his name but not his blood. If Ned stepped aside, Stannis would come down from Dragonstone with fire and steel. If Joffrey remained in power, guided by Cersei and Tywin, House Stark and the North would suffer manipulations or threats. The cost of a Lannister victory would be unthinkable. The Lannisters would not rest until they secured absolute power, and the North would be cowed. Renly, for his part, might attempt a coup with the Tyrells, plunging them all into fresh chaos. And so, with trembling steps, Ned climbed out of that shadowy solar into a new morning. That day, he would decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms and his own. He had the letters from Robert naming him protector of the realm until Joffrey came of age. Those had been forcibly amended before Robert's death. Cersei had tried to ensure that Ned had no claim at all. But the original parchment was still in his possession, signed by Robert Baratheon, though incomplete. Robert had had no suspicion of the children's parentage, but if Ned declared otherwise, if he used the letter to twist the meaning, to stake a new claim, the idea was monstrous, and the seeds of regret were already sprouting in his heart. Yet in that monstrous choice, Ned saw a line of mercy. He would not do it for power, that was certain. He had no desire to keep the Iron Throne for himself forever. Perhaps it could be a temporary measure, a regency of sorts. If he declared that the children were safe under him, that he was their protector in Robert's place, he could keep the Lannisters from launching a preemptive strike, keep Stannis from ordering the children killed as threats to his line, and keep the realm from imploding. He told himself it would be only until he could figure out a gentler solution. He told no one of this yet, not even his daughters. He scarcely could speak it aloud, for fear that once he did, the notion would slip away or grow teeth. Instead, he made arrangements in secret. Varys had always had a knack for gleaning secrets, so Ned approached him carefully, suspecting that the spider already knew far too much. When Ned approached the Master of Whisperers in the Red Keep's labyrinthine corridors, Varys's soft voice greeted him with a hint of amusement. He was robed in his customary silk garments, a slight sheen of perspiration on his bald head despite the early hour. "Lord Stark," he intoned quietly, "it seems you are restless in the night. How can I serve?" Ned found it difficult to trust the eunuch, but he needed eyes and ears. "I must speak with you," he said curtly. "In private." Varys led him into a small chamber with thick walls, the door barred behind them. No servants, no hidden watchers that Ned could detect. Varys turned to face him with that perpetually calm smile. "I suspect you wish to discuss matters of succession, Lord Hand. It weighs heavily on us all, especially in times of uncertainty." Ned nodded, teeth set. "I know you're aware," he said, voice low. "You keep your own counsel, but you know the truth about the parentage of the royal children." He watched for any flicker of response in the eunuch's placid expression. Varys simply inclined his head. "I hear many things. I cannot confirm or deny certain rumors. But if a certain rumor were to be true, well, it could mean grave trouble for all involved." Ned held his ground. "Robert is gone. His children, though not of his blood, are in danger. And this kingdom is on the brink of war." Varys opened his hands, as if to show they were empty. "A sad truth, my lord." Ned inhaled. His heart hammered and thundered. He felt as if he were about to fling himself off a cliff. "If I choose," he said, "if I claim the throne for myself in order to protect them, what will happen?" Now Varys's eyes widened slightly, though his mouth shaped a faint smile. "Truly, that is an intriguing proposition, but a dangerous one. Lord Stark as king? It would be a different realm indeed." He paused, his voice dropping. "But I wonder, why would you, a man so famed for honor, do such a thing?" Ned forced himself to meet Varys's gaze. "To keep them safe. To keep the realm from bloodshed. If Joffrey is cast aside, Stannis will not rest until the children's claims are severed forever. And that would mean the children might be harmed. I cannot allow that." Varys studied him for a heartbeat. "How do you intend to proceed?" "That is what I must ask you," Ned whispered. "If you have the means to ease this transition, I do not want a war, but the Lannisters will fight this to their last man if they suspect I mean to harm the children." Varys tilted his head, silent for a long moment. "You speak of forging a peace with the Lannisters by guaranteeing the safety of these children, while proclaiming yourself king." He let out a slight sigh. "I must confess, Lord Stark, I did not foresee this path, but perhaps it is wise in its own way." Ned's eyes flickered with something like relief and terror at once. "Then I have your support?" Varys pressed his lips together. "I am but a servant of the realm. I will do what is best for the realm." He paused, letting the hush settle. "If you have the means to strike quickly, to remove Cersei and her father from the equation, or at least to neutralize them, you might succeed in a bloodless coup. But your own men are scattered. The gold cloaks might be swayed if you have the coin. Littlefinger controls much of the treasury. Would you trust him?" Ned felt a surge of distaste. Littlefinger was no ally. "I don't trust Peter Baelish, but I might have no choice. If I can offer him a place in my new regime, perhaps he can be convinced to stand aside." "Perhaps," Varys said softly. "Just be sure you do not hand him power. He might turn against you." With that, they concluded their clandestine meeting. Ned returned to his solar with a sense of grim purpose. He had always tried to avoid politics, believing that living by honor and truth would suffice. Now he found himself forced to manipulate, to dissemble. He thought of Catelyn, of how she would react if she heard his plan. She was a Tully, proud and strong, and though she loved him for his honesty, she also knew the harsh realities of the Game of Thrones. Maybe, in some corner of her heart, she would understand. Or maybe she would be appalled. The next few days were a whirlwind, but Ned moved carefully and deliberately. Ser Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, was a decent man, honorable to a fault. Ned dared not tell him the truth about Joffrey's parentage yet, but he trusted that Ser Barristan would protect Myrcella and Tommen from harm. It was a risk not to fully confide in him, but Ned needed to keep the circle of knowledge small until the moment of reveal. He had to time it precisely, or the Lannisters would seize the children, the city, and perhaps Ned's head. He wrote a coded letter to Winterfell, instructing Maester Luwin to gather loyal northern bannermen. He did not explicitly say he meant to seize the throne, but he wrote of the greatest test to House Stark that might soon come. He prayed that would suffice to warn them. He only hoped the Raven arrived safely and that no prying eyes intercepted it. He had no illusions. If Tywin Lannister heard even a whisper of this plan, he would ride for King's Landing at once with a massive host. The city would drown in blood. Ned had to act with speed. Robert's funeral was to take place in a fortnight. The entire court would gather in mourning, including many lords and ladies from across the realm. That would be the moment. He would announce that Joffrey was not the trueborn son of Robert Baratheon, but also proclaim that no harm must come to the children, that he, Eddard Stark, had been named protector of the realm and would now claim the throne to preserve peace. It sounded preposterous. Even thinking on it, Ned felt shame creeping through him. But he kept picturing Myrcella's soft smile, Tommen's earnest eyes. A boy and a girl who had never asked for any of this. Joffrey was older, formidable in his own malicious way, but still a minor, and Ned would see him protected as well. The realm might gape in disbelief, or laugh, or rage, but he had to try to do right by them. The day of Robert's funeral arrived. The sky hung gray above the Red Keep, and a stiff breeze blew in from Blackwater Bay, carrying the mingled stench of salt and smoke from the city's countless chimneys. A hush had settled over the castle corridors, though a throng of mourners filled the great hall, their voices hushed and clothes black and solemn. The Targaryens had burned their dead, but House Baratheon and the Seven Kingdoms generally interred them in the crypts or in great sepulchres. Robert's body, however, had been prepared for display so that the realm might pay its respects. He lay in state in the great September of Baelor. Cersei knelt by the bier in a black silk gown, her golden hair covered by a sheer veil, her face set in a mask of sorrow. Joffrey stood behind her, stiff and proud. Myrcella and Tommen lingered nearby, looking frightened and disoriented. The court was arrayed around them, Pycelle murmuring prayers, Littlefinger eyeing them all with his calculating smirk, Varys shifting in the background. Renly Baratheon stood with Loras Tyrell at his side, grief etched on his face but overshadowed by a certain restless energy. Grand Maester Pycelle chanted the official orisons for Robert's soul. Ned was in his formal attire, the hand of the king's pin glinting on his breast. His face was set like stone. Sansa was at his side, eyes red with tears. Arya stood on his other side, fidgeting. He had warned them as gently as he could that great changes were coming, that they must trust him. But he had told them no more than that. They were children, too, and he would spare them the burdens of adult betrayals until there was no choice. When Pycelle finished the last chant, a hush fell. Joffrey stepped forward, clearing his throat. The High Septon nodded, inviting the king, presumed king, to speak. Ned felt his heart pounding. The Lannisters expected Joffrey to be proclaimed once more, publicly recognized as Robert's successor. Then, in some official capacity, Ned would cede the power of the hand to the new monarch. But that was not what Ned intended. The hush grew into a tense silence. Cersei arched an eyebrow. She glanced at Ned, an unspoken question in her eyes. Perhaps she suspected something. Varys hovered near the dais, and Ned knew that at his signal, the gold cloaks who had been quietly bribed would move. He had Baelish's reluctant word that they would do so. Ned realized his mouth was dry. He stepped forward, voice resonating in the vaulted chamber. "I would speak," he announced, "as the hand of the king, and as the man Robert named protector of the realm." A stir moved through the gathering. Renly's face twisted in confusion. Joffrey's eyes narrowed, and Cersei's lips parted in a silent snarl. She shot a look to the king's guard around her, but Ser Barristan merely frowned, uncertain. Ser Meryn Trant hovered at Cersei's shoulder, tense. Jaime Lannister was absent, still away dealing with some matter at Tywin's command, or so the rumors said. That was one small mercy. Ned swallowed. His voice carried. "Robert Baratheon, may the gods grant him rest, named me protector of the realm in the event of his passing." He held aloft the letter Robert had signed, though the wording had been changed somewhat. "I have the document here," Joffrey broke in. "Then kneel to me, Lord Stark, and give me my rightful crown." The boy's voice was shrill. He was trying to sound regal, but behind his petulance lurked fear. Ned turned, meeting Joffrey's glare. "Your Grace," he said, but did not kneel. "I bear a heavy truth. In the pages of the Book of the Lineages, it is recorded that every Baratheon child has black hair, until now." The great hall fell silent as though the air had been sucked out. Sansa's hand trembled in Ned's, and Arya tensed. Cersei's veil moved as she inhaled sharply, eyes blazing. Ned forged onward, each word an anvil's blow. "Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are not the children of the late King Robert. They are born of incest, the fruits of a union between Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime Lannister. They have no claim to the Iron Throne." Chaos erupted. Some in the court gasped. Others shouted. Ser Meryn reached for his sword, but Ser Barristan put a hand on his arm, perhaps uncertain of who was in command at this moment. Renly took a step back, shock clear on his face. Loras Tyrell's gaze snapped to the dais, hand on his pommel. Cersei surged to her feet, her voice a shriek. "Lies! Treason!" She advanced on Ned, trembling with rage. "He dares speak these falsehoods? Guards, seize him!" Ned braced himself. The moment had come. A shrill whistle echoed through the hall, Varys's signal. Gold cloaks poured in from the sides, some in the pay of Littlefinger, but many loyal to Ned's cause. Others, uncertain, wavered. Cersei's green eyes flashed with hatred. "You dare?" she cried. "My son is the rightful king. You will die for this, Stark." Joffrey screeched incoherently, demanding Ned's head. But the gold cloaks parted, and Baelish stepped forward, smirking. "Your Grace," he said to Joffrey, voice oily as ever. "It seems the realm has questions about your birth. Perhaps we should remain calm and see that no one does anything rash." "Arrest him!" Joffrey shouted again, pointing at Ned, but the City Watch did not move to obey him. Instead, they closed ranks around Ned and the dais, forming a protective arc. Ned's voice boomed once more in the hush that followed. "I will harm none of these children. They are still Robert's wards in heart, if not in blood. They will be protected. But the realm must have a lawful ruler. one untainted by the stain of incest. He took a breath, a swirl of dread in his stomach. Therefore I, Eddard Stark, as the man entrusted by Robert Baratheon to protect this kingdom, do claim the Iron Throne for myself, for the sake of the realm's peace." A stunned silence fell, broken only by the faint sound of Myrcella's weeping and the ominous grinding of Cersei's teeth. Then an eruption of noise. Outraged voices, exclamations of disbelief. Renly looked as though someone had struck him across the face. Loras Tyrell's eyes flicked with something like curiosity, as though wondering if this might be better than the alternative. Cersei lunged forward, a wildness in her eyes. "Treason!" she screamed, pointing at Ned. "He confesses his own treachery, seizing power for himself. Kingslayer!" She called for Jaime, but he was not there. Ned raised his hands, beckoning the crowd to listen. "I have no desire for war," he said loudly. "I will not see these children harmed. They are blameless. But the throne cannot pass to Joffrey, Myrcella, or Tommen, for they are not Robert's children. Let no man say otherwise. Any who stand with me, stand for the peace of the realm." Cersei made to speak again, but Varys intervened, stepping lightly before her. "My queen," he said softly, "perhaps we should not do anything rash, for the good of your children." There was a gentle menace in High's tone that only she could hear. She froze, glancing at Myrcella and Tommen, who clutched each other's hands in fear. The threat was implicit. Any attempt to tear Ned down now could endanger them. Ned forced calm into his voice. "I will see them cared for, your grace," he said, addressing Cersei, ignoring the spittle of her fury. "You have my word as a Stark. They will want for nothing. But I cannot allow them to sit a throne that is not theirs by right." Joffrey spat at Ned's feet. "I'll have your head," he screamed, face twisted in rage. "Mother, do something." But Cersei's fury was checked by the ring of gold cloaks, by Varys's quiet presence, by Ser Barristan's uncertain stance. She realized in that moment that she was outmaneuvered, or at least, that she could not strike without risking her children in the midst of the chaos. Renly stared at Ned with a mixture of betrayal and puzzlement. "Lord Stark," he said, stepping forward, "surely you don't mean you are not of royal blood? My brother Stannis is the rightful heir if Joffrey is not." Ned inclined his head. "Stannis might press a claim, but it would bring war. Thousands would die. If we sever the Lannister hold on the throne now, the city will explode in violence. I was named protector by Robert. I will hold the realm together." Renly opened his mouth to protest, but Loras placed a restraining hand on his arm, as if cautioning him to consider. Baelish offered a maddeningly neutral smile. It was done. The king, if Ned could even call himself that, had been declared. The rest would follow. Guards escorted Cersei and the children away, not cruelly, but firmly, to their quarters, to keep them out of public view. The great hall was left in chaos as lords and ladies debated, shouted, or tried to slip away. The funeral turned into a grim staging ground for a new regime. In the days that followed, Ned found himself in a whirlwind of councils, proclamations, and uneasy negotiations. He repeated constantly that this was a temporary measure, that he did not wish to harm Robert's children, that he only wanted peace. But in the eyes of many, he was a usurper no different from those he had once opposed, a traitor to the rightful heir of House Baratheon, or a liar. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he was Targaryen in secret, others that he'd made a pact with Tywin Lannister, still others that he had Robert's secret will locked in a chest. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was a father who could not abide the murder of children, no matter their parentage. For the moment, the city did not riot. The gold cloaks were loyal enough to keep order, and the small folk did not love the Lannisters. Many had disliked Joffrey's rumored cruelty. Some had respect for Ned Stark's honesty and remembered how King Robert always trusted him. But in the Red Keep, the tension was thick as northern fog. Joffrey was confined to his chambers, chafing under the forced courtesy. He raged and screamed, flung plates at servants, threatened to kill them all once he was freed. Myrcella clung to her mother, tears in her eyes, too frightened to speak. Tommen was wide-eyed, timid, sometimes venturing to ask if he could see Ser Barristan. Ned, for his part, saw that the children were given comfortable rooms and every courtesy. They had a personal guard from the Gold Cloaks to ensure their safety, and he instructed those guards to treat them with kindness. Cersei was another matter. She refused to speak to Ned unless it was to hurl insults. She still tried to manipulate Sansa, or threatened that Tywin would soon march on the city. Ned kept her under a form of palace arrest, though she lived in lavish surroundings. He believed it would keep her from sending out calls for war, but he knew Tywin would hear the news soon enough. When Ned summoned Littlefinger to the council chambers, the man entered with that perpetually mocking tilt to his lips. Ned sat at the long table, now placed at the head seat, the Conqueror's chair looming behind him, a seat he still refused to use. "So," Peter drawled, glancing around, "we have a new king in the Red Keep, one who never wanted the job, or so rumor says." Ned folded his hands. "You know why I have done this, Littlefinger?" Peter shrugged. "To save children from their rightful punishment, or to keep a realm from civil war, or perhaps to keep yourself alive." He flicked an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "But what is it you want from me now?" Ned tried to contain his distaste. "You control the finances, the City Watch, many of the coins that grease the wheels of governance. I need the City Watch to remain loyal if we're to avoid bloodshed. I need to ensure that food still comes into the city so the small folk don't starve. If Tywin Lannister marches, it must not be to a city that tears itself apart from within." Peter gave a calculating nod. "So you want me to keep the peace? I can do that for a price." Ned's jaw tensed. "Name it." Peter's smile grew sharper. "Oh, I have no illusions you'll shower me with gold or promises of dominion. But perhaps you might give me Catelyn's ear. Let me treat with her on certain matters, should she return to King's Landing. We had a friendship once." Ned's eyes blazed. "You overstep yourself, Baelish." "Perhaps," Peter said smoothly, "but I suspect you have no choice. If you want me to keep the watch in hand, feed the city, help you navigate the labyrinth of politics, well, you need me. I will not demand anything more than your goodwill. And yes, the chance to speak with Lady Catelyn if she comes. I promise I mean her no harm, but I'll want that courtesy at least." Ned pressed his lips together, hatred for the man roiling in his gut. But he could not risk the city's stability. "Very well," he bit out. "We have an agreement. But if you move against me—" Peter laughed lightly. "I do not want your throne, Ned. I only want certain opportunities. Fear not, you have your spymaster for the rest." He dipped a mocking bow and departed, leaving Ned to wonder what fresh intrigues he had unleashed by that small concession. Still, the city remained stable for the next few days. Ned convened the small council, what remained of it. Grand Maester Pycelle was too old and dithering to pose much threat. Varys was as careful as ever, offering cryptic remarks that the kingdom watched and waited to see if Stark could hold power. Renly had vanished the day after Robert's funeral, presumably heading south with Loras Tyrell, possibly to gather support for his own claim. The next crisis came with the arrival of a raven from Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon's reply was terse and cold. He had heard of the rumor regarding Joffrey's parentage, of Ned Stark's seizing the throne. Stannis declared Ned's act of vile betrayal, a usurpation, and insisted that if the children were bastards, then by law, the throne was his. He demanded Ned relinquish it at once or face war. The letter fairly oozed anger, and Ned recognized the unyielding sense of justice that had always marked Stannis's character. Ned weighed his response carefully. He sent back a letter just as cold in logic, though gentler in tone. If Stannis pressed his claim, there would be war, with the Lannisters rallying in one corner and possibly the Tyrells in another. House Stark had no desire to tear the realm apart. If Stannis swore to keep the children safe, Ned might consider stepping aside. But Ned suspected that was impossible. Stannis would not willingly allow any Lannister-blooded child to live if they might threaten his claim. He had nightmares of the Bloody Gate, of seeing Myrcella and Tommen hung for the crows. steeled his resolve. A fortnight passed. Rumors spread, fracturing alliances across the realm. The Vale was uncertain. Lisa Arryn was holed up in the Eyrie, refusing to commit. The Riverlands were tense, with Catelyn's father, Hoster Tully, ailing. The Reach was fractious. Mace Tyrell might be open to an alliance with a newly crowned Ned if it meant greater influence. Dorne had not forgotten the death of Elia Martell, but with the Lannisters seemingly losing ground, Prince Doran might see advantage in supporting Ned. The Stormlands were divided, some following Renly, others waiting for a sign from Stannis. The North, Ned hoped, would stand firm behind their lord, but his bannermen might be uneasy about him sitting the Iron Throne. Starks were meant for Winterfell, not the Red Keep. In the Red Keep, Ned moved through the corridors with a constant guard of loyal men. He had replaced many of the Lannister household guards with Northmen who had accompanied him, as well as Crownlanders who had no particular loyalty to Tywin. Every day he received more ravens from all corners. Most demanded an explanation, a promise of what Ned's new kingship would bring, or threatened retribution for slighted claims. Ned found himself drowning in the tasks of monarchy, ever the duty he had never wanted. At night, he could scarcely sleep, haunted by the knowledge that it would take only one blade in the dark to end his life and plunge the city into chaos. Yet, ironically, some of the small folk began to speak well of him. Tales of the Honorable Wolf circulated. They remembered how, even as hand, Ned had sought justice for the butcher's boy Micah, or how he had dismissed the corrupt men on the small council. Now that he was king, though he had not gone through a formal coronation, he ordered bread distributed to the starving in Flea Bottom and cracked down on city guard corruption. Whispers that the wolf is kinder than the lion spread among the commoners. That might keep them on his side if the Lannisters tried to incite riots. Sansa was distraught, torn between her childhood dream of being a queen by marrying Joffrey and the new brutal reality. She sobbed in Ned's arms, unsure what to feel. Arya was more suspicious, saying bluntly that Joffrey was a monster and that she hoped they never had to see him again. Both girls worried for their mother and brothers in the north. Ned tried to console them, but he had little comfort to give. He was too busy trying to keep the realm from shattering like spun glass. The next challenge came when Tywin Lannister's host began to stir in the west. Reports reached King's Landing that Tywin had assembled a large army at Harrenhal, commanding it through his bannermen, and that he was ravaging the Riverlands in the name of rescuing the Queen and her children from the traitor Ned Stark. Ned paled at the news. This was exactly the war he had hoped to avoid. Tywin would not let his grandchildren remain under Ned's control. He would want them returned or at least free to claim the throne. Or he might want them quietly put aside if that strengthened his own power. But Tywin had no direct hold on them now, not unless he took the city by force. Ned called his newly formed council, Peter Baelish, Varys, Grand Maester Pycelle, and Ser Barristan. They gathered in the council chambers. Reports say Tywin has some 20,000 men, Ned said, voice grim. He is sacking small villages in the Riverlands, murdering small folk. We must respond. Barristan frowned deeply. My lord, your grace, if I may, you cannot let the Lannisters continue such atrocities. Yet riding out against them leaves the city vulnerable to Stannis or Renly. Varys's soft voice offered, perhaps we could open negotiations? Tywin might not be entirely opposed to an arrangement, given that we hold the children. They are valuable hostages. Baelish snorted. Hostages or wards? That will be the question. Tywin is known for his pride. He may not forgive or forget that his daughter and grandchildren are at the mercy of House Stark. Ned looked at the table. He despised the idea of using children as bargaining chips, but that was the ugly reality. I will never harm them, he said firmly, but perhaps we can use their safety as a guarantee to keep Tywin from further butchery. I would sooner face him in the field, but you're correct, Barristan. Leaving King's Landing might open us to Stannis or other threats. Pycelle cleared his throat with a rasp. Your Grace, we have an urgent need for alliances. The city's coffers are strained, especially after Robert's many debts. Tywin might well attempt to starve us out. or we risk losing the city to an uprising of the small folk once supplies dwindle. Ned grimaced. We need House Tyrell or House Martell to side with us, or at least remain neutral. And the Riverlands must support us if we are to drive Tywin out. He thought of Catelyn's father, the Tully Lord. I will write to Lord Hoster Tully, reminding him that I have his daughter and grandchildren to consider. He paused, feeling his heart twist. Though I fear that might not be enough. Thus began a desperate scramble for alliances. Ned wrote letters to Dorne, offering to consider a marriage pact, though not with Sansa, who was too young, and he would not force Arya. Perhaps Rickon or Bran in the future. He wrote to Mace Tyrell, offering concessions at court, perhaps the office of Master of Laws for the Tyrells, if they would commit their strength. Renly had been courting the Tyrells as well, possibly offering marriage to Marjorie. But Ned hoped the memory of Ned's honor would carry some sway. Days passed and tension soared. The stench of fear pervaded the Red Keep. Sansa rarely left her chambers, and Arya roamed, restless, trying to practice with Syrio Farrell or listening at doors. She told Ned that the servants whispered of knives in the dark, that some Lannister loyalists remained. Ned placed extra guards on the children's quarters, ensuring that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were safe from any sabotage or kidnapping attempts. Then, a raven arrived from the Westerlands, a formal declaration from Tywin Lannister. He named Ned a usurper and tyrant, demanded the immediate release of the Queen and her children, threatened dire consequences if any harm came to them, and gave Ned 10 days to comply before he marched on King's Landing. The war, it seemed, was inevitable unless Ned capitulated. Ned read the letter in the council chambers, his face pale. 10 days, he murmured. He cannot possibly rally enough men to storm these walls so quickly, but if he unites with the bannermen near Harrenhal and then marches for the capital, we could face a siege. Baelish smirked thinly. Well, your grace, we could always release the children if it suits us. No, Ned said firmly. That would sign their death warrants in one way or another. Tywin might use them as bargaining chips against Stannis and any other claimants, or keep them close until Joffrey is old enough to press his claim again. This war might never end. Barristan cleared his throat, expression sorrowful. Your grace, are we certain we can hold off Tywin's host? The gold cloaks number only so many. The city's walls are formidable, but if Tywin is determined, Ned's hands were cold. He had to consider calling his northern bannermen to march south, but that would leave the north vulnerable if the Ironborn or any other power decided to take advantage. Worse still, winter was coming, as it always did eventually, and traveling so far south was costly. Nonetheless, the letters must go out. He summoned a messenger and wrote to Robb at Winterfell. His young son would have to step up and rally the bannermen. Catelyn, hopefully, was still traveling or might be at the twins negotiating safe passage. The details were uncertain. Everything was uncertain. Days turned to nights, and the shadows of the Red Keep grew longer. Ned felt he was in a pit of vipers. Twice he narrowly avoided suspicious accidents. Once, a stone fell from a parapet near where he walked. Another time, his horse was spooked in the yard. He suspected sabotage by Lannister loyalists. He increased his guard detail. Meanwhile, the city hummed with rumors. Some small folk believed Ned was a hero, saving them from the mad boy Joffrey. Others insisted the Lannisters were the rightful rulers. The tension was a tinderbox. Cersei remained defiant. One evening, Ned visited her in her lavish chambers, where she sat by a window, gazing out at the black waters of the bay. She turned to him with a sneer. "Come to gloat, King Ned?" She spat, voice dripping with scorn. Ned stood tall, though fatigue lined his face. "I came to see if we might avoid a war," he said quietly. "Your father threatens to attack the city. I offer a parley. You know I do not intend to harm your children." Cersei's green eyes were ice. "You stole their birthright. You call them bastards. Publicly humiliated them. They are not Robert's children," Ned said, keeping his voice level. "That is truth, not humiliation. I have tried to treat them with every kindness." Her lips curled. "I do not care what you call it. This is the second time you Starks have ruined my family. First, you aided Robert in toppling the Targaryens. My father lost his best chance at power, though we eventually rose higher. Now you stand in the way of my son's inheritance. The Lannisters always pay their debts. Ned Stark. Ned's jaw clenched. And what of peace? Tywin's men are slaughtering peasants in the Riverlands. She laughed bitterly. Peace? With you on the throne? He will never forgive this insult. You know that. You think a few sweet words will turn him aside? He will come, Ned Stark, and he will tear you down. And I will relish the day I see your head on a spike. Ned turned to leave, heart heavy. For your children's sake, he murmured. I hope you reconsider. She did not answer. Behind her, Myrcella sat on a cushion, tears in her eyes but too frightened to speak. Tommen peeked around a corner, caught Ned's eye, then disappeared. Pained Ned more than he could say, but no words would change Cersei's hatred. He left, wondering what it said of him that he was forcibly keeping her and the children in gilded cages to prevent them from being used as pawns. And yet, that was precisely what they were. Within 5 days, scouts reported Tywin's host crossing the King's Road, a swarm of red and gold banners. They sacked a few more villages along the way, but to Ned's relief, they did not yet besiege the city. Tywin apparently waited at a distance, possibly waiting for reinforcements or hoping for a defection from within. The capital braced itself for a siege anyway. People began hoarding food, and some fled by ship if they had the means. Ned sent out another call to his bannermen, urging them to hurry. He also dispatched riders to the Stormlands, hoping that some lords loyal to Robert might come to his aid. Yet he knew that was uncertain. Many saw him as no more legitimate than the Lannisters. As tensions mounted, Ned sought to keep the city from panicking. He ordered the distribution of extra grain. He oversaw repairs to the walls and gates. He tried to ensure that the gold cloaks did not abuse their power. All the while, a dull ache plagued him. He was a man of the North, forced into southern intrigues, forced to claim a seat he despised. It was all to save those children from the wrath of the realm, but the realm might devour them all anyway. At length, a rider came to the gates under a flag of truce, bearing Tywin's personal sigil. He delivered a missive requesting a parley outside the city walls, a chance for Ned to meet Tywin face to face. A trap? Possibly. But if Ned refused, the city might face immediate siege. Ser Barristan and others advised him not to go, or to go with a large guard. Ned decided on the latter. He would meet Tywin with a retinue of his own men, forming a protective circle. The parley was set for the following dawn, on a flat field north of the city, beneath the watchful eyes of both armies. Dawn broke pink and gold, with thin clouds scudding across the sky. Ned rode out in full armor, a direwolf sigil on his surcoat, flanked by 24 of his best swords, including Jory Castle, who had survived longer in this alternate timeline. The gold cloaks formed a line behind them. In the distance, the Lannister host waited, a sea of crimson and gold. Ned's stomach churned as they approached the meeting ground. He saw a figure on a great warhorse, clad in ornate armor. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, face stern and implacable. Beside him rode a few knights bearing the lion banner, among them a younger man with green eyes. Ser Gregor Clegane was not in sight, though Ned had heard rumors he was raiding the countryside. They came to a halt a sword's length away from each other, a tense hush enveloping them. Tywin's green eyes glittered like polished emeralds. He inclined his head curtly. Lord Eddard Stark, or should I say, Your Grace. His voice dripped contempt. Ned kept his features impassive. Lord Tywin, I am still Ned Stark. That much has not changed. Tywin surveyed Ned's retinue with cool disdain. You have my daughter and my grandchildren confined. You claim the throne for yourself. Do you truly imagine this charade will last? Ned looked him in the eye. They are under my protection. I will not allow them to be harmed. Tywin's mouth tightened. You slander them, label them bastards, then cloak it under protection? You are a thief, Stark. My grandchildren were the rightful heirs of the Iron Throne. The realm knows Robert Baratheon named no other to succeed him. The realm knows differently now, Ned said grimly. I have evidence. The children's own features show the truth. It is done. I have not killed them, nor do I intend to, but they cannot sit the throne. Tywin's gloved hand flexed over the reins. You must be a fool if you think this does not demand blood. Release them to me, or your city will suffer the greatest siege since Maegor's day. I will starve your people. Then I will breach the walls, burn the city, and take them back by force. Ned's men tensed, hands drifting to sword hilts. But Ned kept his composure. And if you do, what do you think will become of your grandchildren in the chaos? I have them well guarded. I have no wish to harm them, but do not force my hand to keep them from being turned into figureheads for another rebellion. Tywin's face reddened slightly, but his voice remained cold. You dare threaten them? I threaten no one, Ned said. I ask for peace. Swear that you will cease these raids, that you will not press Joffrey's claim. In return, I will allow you regular visitation with your grandchildren. See that they are raised in comfort and dignity. Let the realm settle, Tywin. We do not have to drag it into a war. Tywin stared at him for a long moment as though trying to gauge if Ned was mad. Then he barked a harsh laugh. You truly are a damned fool, Eddard Stark. The realm is built on power, not illusions. You have no claim to the throne, and if you think I will let the name Lannister be disgraced, you do not know me at all. He cast a pointed glance at Ned's guard. We will have them back, all of them. I would prefer to do it without bloodshed, but if blood must flow, so be it. Ned realized there would be no peace with Tywin. The man was too proud, too ruthless. Then you doom the realm to war, Ned said quietly, and your grandchildren to uncertain fates. Tywin's lips thinned. It is you who doom them with your vainglorious usurpation. They were King Robert's true heirs in every way that mattered. He flicked the reins, turning his horse. You have 7 days, Stark. Surrender my daughter and my grandchildren to me, or I will tear your precious capital asunder. He rode off, his bannermen in tow. Ned watched them go, heart sinking. There could be no parley with that man. A storm was coming. When he returned to the Red Keep, his shoulders sagged. He summoned the council once more and relayed Tywin's ultimatum. Baelish, Varys, Barristan, and Pycelle listened in stunned silence. Barristan shook his head. We cannot simply hand over the children, your grace. We would lose any moral high ground. And we all know Tywin would likely crown Joffrey and come for your head. Varys agreed. He would not rest until the Lannisters were returned to full power. But can we withstand a siege? Ned asked wearily. The city's stores might last a while, but Tywin's men could block ships from entering. If House Tyrell or others do not come to our aid, we might face starvation in a matter of months. Littlefinger leaned forward. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Perhaps we could persuade one of the other great lords to intervene. The Martells hate the Lannisters, do they not? A timely alliance with Dorne might bring an army from the south. Ned nodded. I have written to Prince Doran Martell. No reply yet. Also to Mace Tyrell, but no guarantee. And the north is far away. The mood was grim. They would have to tighten their belts and prepare. Ned gave orders to strengthen the walls, to gather more supplies. He prayed that reinforcements might arrive from the Riverlands or the Stormlands. Otherwise, they would be left to face Tywin's fury alone. In the midst of these preparations, Ned found a moment of respite, walking alone through the God's Wood at sunset. He knelt before the heart tree, letting the hush of its ancient presence settle his spirit. He remembered Winterfell, the crisp northern air, the silent presence of the old gods. Here, in the south, everything felt unrooted, ephemeral. He was a king in name, but all he wanted was to do right by Robert's memory, to protect children who had never asked to be born into a viper's nest. He thought of his own children, of the risk to them if the city fell. Could he arrange for them to slip away? But that would look like cowardice, and the city might rise against him if they saw him sending his own away while demanding the Lannister children remain. No, he had to see this through. He whispered a prayer. Old gods, Guide me. I only want to keep them safe." The leaves whispered overhead, offering no clear answer. When he emerged from the godswood, he found Arya waiting. She stared at him with solemn gray eyes, her hands behind her back. "Father," she said, "is there going to be a battle?" Ned sighed and ruffled her hair. "I hope not, my little wolf, but we must be prepared." "Why did you take the throne?" Arya asked bluntly, confusion warring with admiration. "I thought you hated all this." He knelt down, looking into her eyes. "I did it to save lives, to protect children who would have been killed or used as pawns. Sometimes, Arya, we must do what we hate for the sake of what is right." She blinked, tears forming. "I wish you didn't have to." He pulled her into an embrace, feeling her small arms wrap around him. He wished that as well with all his heart, but fate had given him no other path, or so he believed. The next day, word came from the north. Robb Stark, the young wolf as some had begun to call him, had called the banners. Thousands of Northmen were gathering near Moat Cailin, preparing to march south. The Freys at the Twins had not barred their passage, though Walder Frey demanded certain concessions. Nonetheless, an army was forming. That brought Ned some relief, though he dreaded the notion of a pitched battle with Tywin Lannister's forces. The realm would burn. They had not yet heard from House Tully, but Ned assumed that if Robb marched, the Tullys might aid him. War, it seemed, was unstoppable. If the Lannisters pressed their siege, the Northmen would come to break it, and the fields of the Crownlands would run red. Meanwhile, Stannis was rumored to be massing ships at Dragonstone, prepared to sail for King's Landing if the city was weakened. And who knew what Renly was plotting with the Tyrells? The land was a tinderbox, and Ned Stark sat at its center on a throne he despised. He managed to secure a fleeting sense of calm for a few days, enough time for the city to store more grain and gather more arms. Then the horns sounded from the walls. The Lannisters were on the march, forming lines outside the city, setting up siege camps. The gold cloaks rushed to man the battlements. Archers took positions on the walls. The city gates were closed. People scrambled in panic. Ned ascended to the ramparts, gazing out over the mass of red and gold tents. He estimated 15,000 men, maybe more, a fraction of Tywin's total strength, but enough to challenge the walls. Perhaps the rest of his army was arrayed in reserve or continuing to loot the riverlands. No formal assault came that first day. Instead, Tywin's catapults and siege towers were being assembled, a grim promise. At dusk, a herald approached under a flag of truce, shouting that Tywin demanded the city's surrender and the return of the Queen and her children. Ned gave the official reply, "King's Landing stands firm. We will not yield." So it began, the siege of King's Landing, with Eddard Stark, reluctant king, facing the cunning wrath of Tywin Lannister. A hush of terror fell on the capital that night. Torches glimmered along the walls, and within the Red Keep, Ned tried to sleep but found himself pacing in his solar. He prayed that the Northmen and any allies would arrive soon, that they might break the siege before the city starved. But how many would die in the meantime? On the second day, Tywin's forces began to probe the walls. Lannister crossbowmen loosed bolts at the ramparts, while engineers moved siege towers slowly forward. The defenders poured arrows and rocks down on them, lit pitch searing the air. Screams echoed on both sides. Ned stood atop the walls, directing archers as best he could, though warfare of this scale was not his favorite domain. He heard the groans of wounded men, the crash of rams at the outer gates. The city watch held for the moment, but the look in their eyes was uncertain. Would they die for a man who had seized the crown so recently? That question gnawed at Ned. A few hours into the assault, the Lannisters pulled back, having tested the defenses. Bodies littered the field. Ned returned to the Red Keep, his boots sticky with blood and mud. He removed his helm, feeling older than his years. This was what he had tried to prevent. He found himself wishing he could speak again to Tywin, to reason with him, but that was foolishness. Tywin would never bend. He went to check on the captive royal children. Joffrey was sullen and furious, pacing like a caged lion. Myrcella and Tommen clung to each other, terrified by the sounds of distant warfare. Cersei refused to see Ned, but the guards reported her cursing him daily, hurling vases against the walls in her rage. Ned only instructed them to remain kind, to supply them with fresh food and clothing, to let them roam the corridors under guard if they wished. On the third day, Tywin attempted an attack on the King's Gate. His rams hammered, but the defenders rained flaming pitch, and the gate held. That night, the small folk huddled in corners, fear etched on every face. The markets were shuttered. Men hammered boards over windows. Fires sprang up in Flea Bottom, presumably from some stray catapult shot or an opportunistic looter. The gold cloaks tried to contain it. King's Landing began to reek of smoke and fear. Ned's only solace came from letters that trickled in from the north, telling him Robb was on the march, crossing the Neck. Another raven from the Riverlands carried the Tully sigil, stating that Edmure Tully would muster men at Riverrun. But how long until they arrived? The city might be battered into submission first. And if Robb's host confronted Tywin's in open battle, the toll would be immense. Still, day by day, the defenders held. The Lannisters seemed hesitant to commit to a full assault, possibly wary of heavy losses against the city walls. Instead, they slowly tightened the noose, cutting off supply lines, preventing ships from docking. By the end of the week, panic about food shortages spread. Ned ordered strict rationing, which made him even less popular among the common folk. But many still remembered the alternative, Joffrey as king, so the city remained more or less loyal for now. In the midst of the siege, Stannis Baratheon's ships suddenly appeared off the coast. Scouts reported that a fleet was massing, possibly to land men to the south or blockade the port. Ned realized that if Stannis attacked from the sea while Tywin pressed from the land, King's Landing might be trapped between two enemies. The notion turned his blood to ice. He summoned the council again. Baelish was first to speak. "It seems your plan to avoid a multi-front war has failed, Your Grace. The sharks are circling." Ned fixed him with a glare. "I do not need your cynicism. I need solutions." Varys coughed delicately. "If Stannis sees Tywin as the bigger threat, he may hold back, waiting to strike when we are weakened. We might attempt to negotiate with Stannis. Offer him terms." Ned grimaced. "We know what he wants. The throne. He sees himself as the rightful heir if the children are bastards. That means he will not compromise unless I yield to him. But if I do, the children are again in danger." Pycelle peered over folded hands. "Your Grace, might we propose a marriage alliance? Stannis has a daughter, Shireen, though she is but a child. Perhaps a match with one of your sons in future? It may buy us peace." Ned's brow knitted. "I will consider it, but I doubt it will be enough to appease him. He is a man of rigid honor. He believes the law is on his side." Ser Barristan's face was grim. "We must also consider that if Stannis lands and Tywin sees a chance to crush him, the city may find itself a battlefield between the two. The cost in lives." He trailed off, and Ned saw the sorrow in his eyes. Barristan had served so many kings, watched so many wars. Desperate and exhausted, Ned decided to pen a letter to Stannis, urging him to consider the threat of Tywin Lannister as paramount, to join forces in removing the Lannister menace from the city's gates. He offered to later discuss the matter of succession in a great council, with the lords of the realm deciding. It was a half measure, a faint hope, but if it delayed Stannis from attacking, it might help. Time dragged on. The second week of siege arrived, and the city was short on fresh food. Tywin's men tested the walls again, sending a wave of soldiers with ladders. The defenders beat them back after fierce fighting. Ned stood on the battlements, sword in hand, cutting down a Lannister man-at-arms who tried to climb up. His arm burned from the exertion. The city watch fought bravely, though some deserted in the night, slipping over walls or through hidden gates. Morale flagged. Amid the chaos, a single ship slipped into the harbor at night, managing to evade the Lannister watchers in the bay. It bore the sun and spear sigil of Dorne. A delegation of Dornishmen arrived in the Red Keep, presenting letters from Prince Doran Martell. They offered to parley with Ned. If the Martells allied with him, that might turn the tide. But the price was high. Justice for Elia Martell, the Targaryen princess murdered during the sack of King's Landing, demanded certain punishments for those involved, namely Tywin Lannister and his bannermen. They also demanded influence in the new regime, seats on the small council, and possibly a marriage alliance with the Starks. Ned swallowed his distaste for politics. If this was the only way to save the city and end the siege, he might have to do it. Justice for Elia was something he believed in anyway, though it might complicate any future peace with the Lannisters. He told the Dornish envoys he would consider their terms if they committed troops immediately. The envoys wanted to coordinate with their prince, but sending a raven might take time. Even as he tried to forge alliances, Ned could feel the city unraveling. Riots sparked in Flea Bottom when the bread stores ran low. Gold cloaks clashed with mobs of hungry small folk. Buildings burned, black smoke rising over the city. The stench of fear thickened. Ned devoted resources to quelling unrest, pulling men from the walls. Tywin's watchers took note. Less men on the ramparts meant an opening. On the 15th day of siege, at dawn, Tywin launched a concerted assault from multiple points. Battering rams struck at the King's Gate and the Lion Gate, while siege towers rolled forward near the Mud Gate. Lannister infantry rushed the walls under cover of arrows. The City Watch fought valiantly, but the defenders were spread thin. Ned rushed from one embattled gate to the next, trying to rally the men. Arrows whizzed past him. Smoke from pitchfires stung his eyes. The clang of steel on steel was deafening. For hours the battle raged. Ladders clattered against walls. Men screamed and fell. Flames licked up the siege towers. Tywin's men tried to breach the gates with heavy rams, but stones and boiling oil rained down on them. Casualties piled up on both sides. By midday, the assault slowed. The Lannisters hadn't broken through, but they'd inflicted harsh losses. The King's Landing defenders were exhausted, battered. The city, already short on supplies, was now short on manpower as well. In his war council that evening, Ned learned that they might not survive another major assault. They needed relief from outside. He could only pray that Robb's army or an alliance with Dorne or the Vale might come in time. So far, the Vale had not stirred. Lisa Arryn was too afraid or too apathetic to get involved, and her nephew was a sickly child. Late that night, Ned received a raven from Robb, stating that the northern host was crossing the Trident, having negotiated passage with Walder Frey. They had joined forces with some of the River Lords. If the combined Stark-Tully army marched swiftly, they could catch Tywin's forces from behind. But it might take another 2 weeks to reach King's Landing, if not more. The city might fall before then. Ned was bone-tired. He walked the corridors, passing silent guards, hearing the distant moans of wounded men. He paused by the children's quarters. To his surprise, Tommen stood in the corridor, a wide-eyed boy, tears in his eyes. "My lord," Tommen said uncertainly. "Is it true people are dying?" Ned's heart broke. He gently knelt. "Yes, Tommen. There is a war outside." Tommen sniffled. "Why does there have to be a war? I don't want anyone else to die. Mother says you stole our throne. Joffrey says he'll kill you one day." Ned exhaled, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know this is all very confusing. I did what I thought was right to keep you safe. I'm sorry for all the suffering it has caused." Tommen hung his head. "I'm scared." Ned's throat tightened. "I will not let harm come to you," he said. "That I promise." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes, then hurried back inside. The door shut, leaving Ned alone. He realized that for all the politics, all the talk of armies, it was children like Tommen and thousands of small folk who bore the cost. He felt sick, haunted by the inescapable knowledge that his choice had ignited a new war. Even if his intentions were pure, the realm was ablaze. On the 16th day, a new wave of attackers marched under the Lannister banner. But this time, a side gate near the Hook was sabotaged from within. Some unknown conspirators, maybe Lannister loyalists, had opened a sally port. Lannister men poured into a narrow street, clashing with gold cloaks in a brutal melee. Word reached Ned quickly. He scrambled a res. force to seal the breach. If the Lannisters established a foothold inside the walls, King's Landing would fall. Ned himself led a contingent of spearmen. The fighting in the narrow street was vicious. Men jammed shoulder to shoulder, thrusting blades in the half-light. Smoke from burning buildings choked them. Ned could barely see as he hacked at the men in crimson cloaks pushing forward. He saw gold cloaks fall left and right, heard the screams of wounded men echo in the narrow alley. Blood slicked the ground. At one point, a Lannister knight charged him, swinging a sword high. Ned raised his blade, parrying, feeling the jolt in his arms. He pivoted, deflecting another blow, gritting his teeth as the knight tried to slam him against the wall. Ned was no tourney champion, but his northern resilience and calm served him. He managed to slip his blade under the knight's guard and pierce his side. The man fell with a gurgling cry. Jory Castle appeared, rallying the gold cloaks, pushing the Lannisters back. Slowly, foot by foot, they drove them from the sally port. A makeshift barricade was erected to block further entry. Eventually, the enemy retreated, leaving bodies strewn in the street. Ned stood panting, sword dripping, adrenaline surging. He felt a stab in his thigh, some blow he hadn't even realized had cut him. He pressed a hand to the wound, wincing. Another day survived, but how many more times could they repel such incursions? He limped back to the Red Keep, letting a maester tend to him. That night, as he lay in bed with bandages on his thigh, the weight of the war pressed on him like a boulder. He wondered if he should have simply let Stannis take the throne and prayed he would spare the children, or let Renly try. Perhaps all of this was in vain. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by nightmares of Robert, by the bodies burning in the streets. Dawn brought more smoke and gloom. The siege ground on. Yet, on the 18th day of the siege, as Ned stood on the ramparts, scanning the horizon, he heard a sudden commotion of horns. At first, he feared it was Tywin launching another all-out assault. But then he saw, in the distance across the fields, new banners emerging. The dire wolf of House Stark, the trout of House Tully. A host was descending on Tywin's rear. Robb Stark had come at last. A battle exploded across the plains outside King's Landing. Tywin's men, caught between the city walls and the new arrivals, scrambled to form ranks facing both directions. Ned ordered the gold cloaks to sally forth, striking from the gates, while Robb's host attacked from the rear. The walls erupted with cheers, trumpets blared, and the gates were thrown open. Ned led the charge, sword in hand, though still limping from his wound. The defenders, heartened by the sudden arrival of allied banners, stormed into Tywin's lines. From the north came the sound of war horns. He glimpsed Robb in the distance, surrounded by mounted bannermen. The two armies clashed with terrifying force. The thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the cries of the dying. Banners fell and rose. Dust clouded the field. Tywin's men fought fiercely, but they were pinned between city walls and a fresh northern host. Many tried to flee. Some turned to hold off the Northmen while others tried to break back for the siege camp. The fighting lasted hours. By late afternoon, the Lannister lines buckled. Tywin himself was forced to withdraw, retreating with the remnants of his army westward. King's Landing was free, for now. Ned, exhausted and blood-smeared, found Robb on the battlefield among cheering Northmen. His son had grown taller, more confident, though the war had clearly hardened him. Their reunion was brief but poignant. Ned embraced Robb, ignoring the gore and sweat, tears in his eyes. Robb's voice was grim. "Father, we came as soon as we could. The phrase delayed us. We brought what men we could muster. The Lannisters are pulling back. They may regroup. We've captured some. Tywin was not among them. He escaped." Ned nodded. "Thank the gods you arrived when you did." The city was on the brink. They both gazed at the retreating Lannister banners, the dying men scattered across the fields. The smoke from the battered city hung in the distance. That evening, they limped back into King's Landing. The small folk crowded the streets, cheering for the new arrivals who had driven away the hated Lannisters. Ned, battered and weary beyond words, found a moment's peace in the Red Keep's courtyard, leaning on a pillar while the gold cloaks reclosed the gates. Rob dismounted, clapping dust from his gloves, looking around warily at the grand castle. "Is it over?" Rob asked softly. Ned shook his head. "For now, Tywin is driven off. But he is not beaten. Stannis still lurks. Renly too. The realm is far from settled." He gazed into the middle distance, hearing faint cheers from the city that might turn to cries of hunger if the roads remained unsafe. He took a long breath. "We may have only delayed more bloodshed." Rob placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You did what you had to do, father. You protected those children, saved King's Landing from itself. Perhaps in time the realm will see that." Ned offered a wan smile, though sorrow tugged at his eyes. "Let us hope so. The next steps will be more difficult. We must somehow forge a peace, and that may require a heavier sacrifice than any of us can foresee." They stood together in the courtyard, father and son, in the gathering dusk, as the city around them celebrated a fleeting victory, unaware of how many battles still lay ahead, or the fragile foundation upon which King Eddard Stark's uneasy reign was built. And though the night air was filled with the din of revelry, far off on the horizon storms gathered, each one threatening to tear the Seven Kingdoms apart once more. Yet for that single moment, Ned closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine a realm at peace, a realm where the children he had tried so hard to protect, Sansa and Arya, Myrcella and Tommen, even Joffrey, might grow in safety, where no more innocence would be ground beneath the wheel of power, where Robert's memory might be honored rather than drowned in blood. A realm that perhaps would never be, but he had to try. He opened his eyes, breathed the smoke-scented air, and readied himself to face whatever trials the morrow would bring.